So my topic for you today is the past a foreign country? That, of course, is the first line of L.P. Hartley's book, The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. But my question for you today is it? And if it is, why does popular culture always present the past as something so cosy and actually not alien at all? And if it is, finally, can we go there? Do we have a visa? Do we have the passport that we need? Historians might actually go further. They might not just say that it's a foreign country, but that it's actually an imaginary country, that it's more Narnia than France. Because, of course, the extraordinary thing about the past is that it was, and it is not. History is the study of something that doesn't exist. And sometimes it feels like the veil between us and the past is therefore great. But thankfully, there are footprints in the snow for us to follow, should we choose to go. But history in the popular media tends to be something that stresses the similarities between us and them, so that they were people who ate, people who slept, people who fell in love, who needed to wash, who hoped, who believed, who dreamed, who died, just as we will do. In fact, G.M. Trevelyan said this. He said, "The poetry of history is the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, on this familiar spot of ground, walked other people, other men and women as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone. One generation vanishing after another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cock-crow." So when you come across history in the popular media, you tend to come across stories that tell you things that you know. So the great disaster of Titanic is portrayed as a love story. The Other Berlin Girl, which has Eric Bana, Scarlett Johansson, Natalie Portman, reimagines Tudor history as chick-lit sibling rivalry. Braveheart takes arguably a treasonous criminal and makes him into a freedom fighter. Or a film like The Duchess, which is the story about an 18th century aristocrat, had the strapline, "There were 3 in their marriage," and it came out just a year after the death of Princess Diana. And often, actually, what we hear about is a story of shared emotions with the past. I used to work at Hampton Court Palace. As part of an exhibition there on Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey, there's a doorway which has inscriptions of all of those children who died soon after birth, or were stillbirths, or miscarriages for Catherine of Aragon. And one academic we worked with said he'd always known that, but it was only when he saw it on this doorway, which happens to look a little bit like a tomb, that he really felt it. He felt that connection to the past. This is history as sympathy. This is creating connections. And perhaps we stress this because if we feel that we can learn lessons from the past, we have to assume that there's something meaningful in those lessons. And there can only be something meaningful if we are essentially like them. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, said Mark Twain. Dan Snow came to talk to my students at New College of Humanities the other day, and he said, the past doesn't repeat itself, but it's the best guide we've got. So perhaps that's why we stress the familiarity with the past. Our interest in the past is because we're really interested in ourselves. Simon Sharma put it like this: history ought never to be confused with nostalgia. It is written not to revere the dead, but to inspire the living. It's our cultural bloodstream, the secret of who we are. Perhaps that's why Who Do You Think You Are is such a popular programme. This is all about our story. And if we do look at the differences of the past, the differences we tend to look at are external, superficial ones. So if you look at reality TV programmes, 1900 House, 1940s House, they point to things like they don't have electricity, or they have different clothes, or they wash with lyre rather than shower gel. This is the past as hardship and privation. This is history as something that's dirty and messy and painful. They're people like us, but they're just in harder circumstances. And again, the question comes to us: what would we do in such circumstances? And this is history as progress. This is a Whiggish version of history. And I think that explains partly, at least, the fascination that we have with horrible histories. Terry Dealey's Horrible Histories have sold something like 20 million copies since they launched in 1993, been translated into 31 languages. They market themselves as history with the nasty bits left in. And of course, we're all slightly perversely fascinated by gore. But it's also about history being to congratulate ourselves, to suggest that we're very humane. How civilized we are. We don't do these things to people. And so what we look for in films, when we call it authenticity, that those external details, often is quite superficial. It might, for example, come down to making sure they've got the right clothes on. Although quite often we change that so it fits to present-day standards of attractiveness as well. Tom Hanks was the producer on Band of Brothers, and he said there are two types of authenticity. The one that says you've got all the buttons right, that the ammunition is correct, that the buildings look as they looked in the photo, that's relatively easy to achieve. But then there's a thing that's much harder. That's literally the motivations and the nature of the interplay between the characters. Because he says if we can't be absolutely truthful to what they said and did at any given time, we can at least be as authentic as possible, so that it still adheres to the framework of the reality of being there at that moment. But I would suggest there's a third type of authenticity, the one that we daren't go near. This is the one that says the past is so very different from our own that we fail to understand it because we only understand our own time. And that is because people in the past had different mental and imaginative worlds to us. The Annales historians have called these mentalités, the mentalities of these people. And perhaps this is the difference between popular history and academic history. Is popular history more interested in the similarities rather than the differences? You can particularly note this when you look at attitudes towards sex and religion, if you read a historical novel or you see a film. For example, Philippa Gregory's books, wonderful historical novels that transport you back to the past. But quite often the women in them tend to be essentially proto-feminists. And their attitudes towards sex tend to be, well, it's quite a good thing, let's get on with it. Which before the age of the pill, before there was any reliable contraception, isn't congruent with the age of the past. And how about religion? Rochefoucauld in the 17th century said there's always something ridiculous about the emotions of people that one has ceased to love. And if, in modern Britain, many people have fallen out of love with God, we shouldn't underestimate quite how intoxicating a power he had in centuries past. Make sure the things you read have that sense of reality about worldviews. This is perhaps why Hilary Mantel's books have been so popular and so prize-winning, because although she creates characters, her historical characters like Cromwell, for example, are from her own imagination, as is the novelist's prerogative, she does actually immerse herself into the world of the past. I remember being delighted when I read Wolf Hall and realising that she had identified that to call something new in the 16th century was not a compliment. We have faint echoes of this idea now. The word novelty carries something of the hostility and suspicion that the new had in an age when the traditional and the ancient were powerful things and had a powerful hold on the Tudor mind. It's only when we can begin to grasp how different the past was, how differently people thought in the past, that we can begin to comprehend some of the more bizarre behaviours and beliefs of the past. Let me give you a few examples from the period I work on. In the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, across Europe, 40 to 50,000 people, mostly old women, were executed as witches. In the 16th century, in England, beggars were whipped. In 1547, it was ordered that vagabonds, aka the homeless, should be branded on the chest with a V made with a hot iron. In 1572, a new statute suggested that they should be grievously whipped and they should be branded through the ear hole with a hot iron an inch in diameter. In 17th century Vienna, a common practice when a criminal was beheaded was for someone who was suffering from what was known as the falling sickness to rush in with a jug, scoop up the hot spurting blood, down it in one, and then sprint off. This was thought to cure epilepsy. In London, around the same time, 1665, during the Great Plague, the Chamberlain of the city ordered 200,000 cats and 40,000 dogs to be culled because it was thought they spread the plague. And women, and perhaps this is the most bizarre one of all, since the time of Aristotle through to about the 18th century, were thought to be deformed men. Their uteruses were inverted penises. They just hadn't had enough heat to push them out of their body. And of course, this produced a great anxiety. Occasionally, you had stories circulating of a woman or a girl leaping over a fence, and then, gosh, they discovered she was a man. Her penis fell out. And of course, if it could be done like that, it could be reversed as well. There was a certain anxiety about being a man in early modern England. We have a tendency to look at the past and think they were just like us. But what was going on inside their heads was really, really different. If we're going to get any insight from those TV reality shows at all, perhaps it comes when they fall down. So in 1940s House, the War Committee, as it were, gave them rabbits to eat. And the family refused to eat them because, of course, they had the mentality of today. In the one called The Trench, where a group of young boys pretended to go to have an experience of being on the front line in World War I, somebody brought along, a corporal brought along a greatcoat of one of those who was said to have fallen. And there was something both poignant and also completely ridiculous about this moment because, of course, the chap hadn't fallen, he hadn't died, he'd just left the show. And the reality of that moment, of what it must have been like to lose a friend, a companion, in World War I, was still missing. And how we view the past matters, whether we see it as foreign or familiar. Particularly, for example, it matters in questions of moral judgment. Can we judge the past? Academic historians generally say no. We need to try and understand it. We need to give it all the respect it's due. But when you think of the Holocaust, when you think of Hitler, when you think of slavery, would it not be wrong to judge? The historian Collingwood said this: "To pass moral judgment on the past is to fall into the fallacy of imagining that somewhere behind a veil the past is still happening, as if it's now being enacted in the next room and we ought to break in and stop it. But these things have been. They are over. There is nothing to be done about them." We need to seek to understand the past, but we need to don not just historical clothing that we always call costume for some reason I never understand. We need to don their mindset. We need to get out our guidebooks. So, is the past a foreign country? Yes, very much so. But it's different in ways that we haven't imagined. It's a bit like saying that France isn't so different because they eat baguettes, but because they think nothing odd about having a mistress and a wife at a funeral. They just have a different mentality. So why do we make the past so cosy? Well, I would suggest it's because the past is not just foreign, it's also dangerous. We have a sense that behind that veil there are glinting swords and bared teeth. That if we actually knew what went on in the past and what went on in their minds, we might understand a bit more about the human condition than we really want to. But I would suggest to you that if we want to get to that foreign land, we have to be, as it said in Macbeth, bold, bloody, and resolute. We need to be brave. We need to step through the looking glass into the other side and not keep on gazing at our own reflections. Thank you.